Something is burning in the Middle East, and in this time the smoke is rising directly over Riyadh. Not from a wildfire, not from an accident, from missiles, from drones, from a war that the world kept calling someone else's problem, until it wasn't anymore. Until it crossed borders, skipped over diplomacy, and landed with a sound that shook windows and rattled the confidence of the most powerful kingdom in the Arab world. Saudi Arabia, the country that sits on the largest oil reserves on the planet, the country that has shaped global energy prices for decades, the country that billions of people depend on without ever realizing it, is being pulled into a war it cannot afford to fight, cannot afford to lose, and is finding it harder and harder to avoid. Every morning, the men who manage Saudi Arabia, its national security, sit in rooms that smell of fresh coffee and old fear, looking at maps covered in red arrows pointing at their borders from multiple directions at once. And behind it all, pulling the strings, setting the fires, and watching from a careful distance, is Iran. This is not a story that started yesterday. This is a fire that has been burning for over 40 years, fed slowly, deliberately, with the kind of patience that only nations carrying long memories and longer grudges can manage. Iran and Saudi Arabia have been locked in a Cold War wrapped inside a religious rivalry, wrapped inside a geopolitical chess match that has quietly shaped everything from the price of oil at your local gas station to the stability of entire governments across Africa, Asia, and Europe. But what was once cold is getting hotter. What was once hidden behind proxy forces and careful denials is now crashing through the open air in the form of ballistic missiles. Attack drones and coordinated strikes on Saudi soil that have left craters, casualties, and a burning question hanging over the entire region. How much further can this go before it becomes something the whole world has to answer for? How many more sirens? How many more fires? How many more close calls before the next one is not a close call at all? To understand where this is going, you have to understand where it came from. You have to go back before the drone strikes, before the oil field attacks, before the diplomatic collapses and the severed ties, all the way back to 1979. The year that cracked the Middle East open along a fault line that has never fully healed. That was the year the Iranian Revolution changed everything. In one dramatic, stunning sweep, the government of Iran was transformed from a Western-aligned monarchy under Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi into an Islamic republic under Ayatollah Khomeini, a government that did not simply govern its people, but declared itself the leader of a global Islamic movement. And it declared, loudly, clearly, with no diplomatic ambiguity, no polite hedging, that the monarchies of the Gulf, including Saudi Arabia, were corrupt, illegitimate, and enemies of the true path of Islam. Saudi Arabia heard that message. They felt it in their bones. They saw it as an existential challenge to everything they had built, everything they were, every source of their legitimacy, and they never forgot it. Not through any summit, not through any diplomatic exchange, not through any brokered handshake. That message from 1979 has echoed down through every decade since, growing louder with each new conflict, each new proxy war, each new missile that lights up the desert sky. The rivalry between these two nations runs deeper than politics. It runs through religion in a way that cuts right through communities, through families, through centuries of history that ordinary people carry like weight they were born with and cannot put down. Saudi Arabia is the heart of Sunni Islam. It is home to Mecca and Medina, the two holiest cities on earth for over 1 billion Muslims. The Saudi royal family has built the bedrock of its legitimacy around its role as the custodian of the two holy mosques, the protectors of Sunni Islam's most sacred ground, the servants of every Muslim pilgrim who makes the Hajj, the guardians of a religious heritage that reaches back to the very birth of the faith. This is not just a political identity for Saudi Arabia, it is their purpose. It is the story they tell themselves about why they exist and why they deserve to lead. Iran, meanwhile, is the world's largest Shia Muslim nation, and since 1979, its government has positioned itself with aggressive conviction as the defender and champion of Shia Muslims everywhere on earth, not just inside Iran's borders, but in Lebanon, in Iraq, in Yemen, in Bahrain, in Pakistan, in every country where Shia communities live under pressure or what Iran calls persecution. Iran has spent 40 years building this identity, funding this cause, training fighters, arming movements, and extending its influence through religious and political networks that span the entire Muslim world. Where Saudi Arabia sees corrupt rulers and ungrateful subjects, Iran sees oppressors and their victims. And where Iran sees itself as liberator, Saudi Arabia sees a revolutionary force determined to destabilize every government in the region that does not bow to Tehran. This is a rivalry that plays out in mosques and madrasas, in political parties and parliaments, in armed militias and intelligence operations that most people never hear about until something explodes. It is religious, and it is political, and it is deeply personally felt on both sides. And it has made the Middle East into a region where almost every conflict, almost every crisis, almost every uprising can be traced back to this same dividing line. Saudi Arabia and its allies on one side, Iran and its network on the other, and millions of ordinary people caught in between, living the consequences of a rivalry they did not choose and cannot escape. But here is where the story takes a very specific and very dangerous turn. Iran, for all its power and ambition and revolutionary fire, is not able to fight Saudi Arabia directly, not in the traditional military sense. The Saudi military is better funded, better equipped, and backed by the United States with weapon systems, intelligence support, and security guarantees that Iran simply cannot match in a conventional face-to-face conflict. Saudi Arabia has Patriot missile batteries. Saudi Arabia has F-15 fighter jets. Saudi Arabia has decades of American military partnership that has produced the most capable air force in the Arab world. A direct conventional war between Iran and Saudi Arabia would not end well for Iran in purely military terms. So Iran developed a different strategy, a strategy so clever, so patient, and so effective that military analysts around the world have spent years studying it and still struggle to fully counter it. Iran built a network of proxy forces, armed groups that fight Iran's battles without Iran ever having to officially declare war, groups that give Iran what military strategists call plausible deniability, the ability to strike enemies and then step back and say, with practiced calm, that was not us. We cannot control what other groups decide to do. We stand for peace and stability in the region. The translation of this, in the real world, is that Iran can rain missiles on Saudi Arabia and then attend diplomatic meetings and discuss trade agreements with a straight face. The most powerful of these proxy forces, the one that has caused Saudi Arabia the most direct pain, the most lost sleep, the most strategic anxiety, and the most real military damage, is the Houthi movement in Yemen. Yemen sits on Saudi Arabia's southern border. It is one of the poorest countries in the world, a nation broken by decades of internal conflict, tribal divisions, and devastating poverty so deep that when international aid workers arrive, they describe what they see in terms that sound like the descriptions of famines from centuries past. Children with distended bellies, hospitals running on donated candles, families burning furniture to stay warm because they have nothing left to burn. But Yemen's misery is not only a humanitarian story, its geography makes it a military story of enormous importance. Whoever controls territory in northern Yemen, the Houthi stronghold, is sitting inside missile range of major Saudi cities. And since Iran began pouring weapons, training, intelligence, and money into the Houthi movement, that proximity has become something Saudi Arabia feels in its nerves every single time a siren wails over Riyadh or a flash lights up the southern desert sky and the radar screen starts screaming. The Houthis, formerly known as Ansar Allah, which translates to supporters of God, began as a religious and political movement in northern Yemen in the 1990s. Their founder, Hussein Badreddin al-Houthi, was a Zaydi Shia scholar and politician who grew increasingly radical in his opposition to the Yemeni government and its close ties to the United States and Saudi Arabia. He preached in mosques, built a following, and developed a theology of resistance that blended religious piety with political fury. After his death in 2004, during a government crackdown, a crackdown funded and encouraged by Saudi Arabia, the movement bearing his name did not fade away in mourning. It grew angrier. It absorbed the grievances of a marginalized Shia community, the rage of a population exhausted by corruption and neglect, and eventually the weapons and the strategic guidance of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, the elite military force that serves as the primary engine, the beating heart, of Iran's overseas influence operations. By 2014, the Houthis had swept down from their mountain strongholds and captured Sana'a, Yemen's capital city, in a move that shocked the entire region and sent the internationally recognized Yemeni government fleeing south to Aden, and then out of the country entirely. Saudi Arabia watched this happen and saw it for exactly what it was. Iran, through the Houthis, was planting a hostile military force directly on Saudi Arabia's doorstep, an Iranian forward base disguised as a Yemeni liberation movement. In March 2015, Saudi Arabia responded by launching a military coalition that began a comprehensive air campaign in Yemen, a campaign that was supposed to last weeks, restore the recognized government, and push the Houthis back into the mountains. Instead, it stretched into years, then into a decade, and it continues shaping what the United Nations has repeatedly described as the worst humanitarian crisis on Earth. But Saudi Arabia's military intervention in Yemen did not push the Houthis back into irrelevance. It did something entirely different. It hardened them. It gave them a cause, a narrative of resistance against a powerful aggressor, a story they could tell their fighters and their supporters that made every sacrifice feel righteous and every casualty feel like martyrdom. And it deepened their reliance on Iran, which used the Saudi intervention as both justification and cover for increasing the quality and quantity of weapons flowing into Houthi hands. The weapons that Iran began providing to the Houthis were not the crude guns and mortars of a typical rebel group scratching for survival in the mountains. They were precision-guided ballistic missiles with ranges far beyond anything a Yemeni group could have developed on its own. They were armed drones, in designs that evolved with terrifying speed from basic, primitive platforms into sophisticated weapons capable of flying hundreds of kilometers, hugging the ground to avoid radar detection, and striking specific targets with accuracy that military planners had never expected from a non-state actor, operating in a country without a functioning government, without a real economy, without a proper military-industrial base. The attacks started coming, and they did not stop. Riyadh's King Khalid International Airport was targeted multiple times, strikes that forced emergency diversions of aircraft and sent hundreds of thousands of passengers scrambling through terminals as sirens howled. Saudi Aramco oil facilities were hit. Oil pipelines that carry the lifeblood of the Saudi economy across hundreds of kilometers of open desert were struck, igniting fires that burned for days. Saudi military bases, radar installations, and air defense systems were probed and attacked in operations that grew in ambition and complexity with every passing year. As the Houthis absorbed what they learned from each engagement, and Iran upgraded their capabilities in response to each failure. And through all of it, Iran stood at a careful distance and denied direct involvement, even as the missiles recovered from attack sites bore serial numbers and components that pointed unmistakably, irrefutably back to Iranian factories and Iranian military programs. Then came the attack that changed the conversation entirely and forced the whole world to pay attention in a way it had been avoiding. September 14th, 2019. It was still dark in the pre-dawn hours over eastern Saudi Arabia when a swarm of drones and cruise missiles descended on the Abqaiq oil processing facility and the Kurayz oil field. Estimates put the number of individual projectiles at over 20. These were not just any targets chosen for symbolic effect. Abqaiq is the single most strategically important oil facility on Earth. Not just in Saudi Arabia, not just in the Middle East, on Earth. It processes approximately 7% of the entire world's daily oil supply. When those drones hit their marks and fires erupted that could be seen from miles away, when pillars of black smoke climbed into the Saudi sky like dark prayers to a god of destruction, the world's most critical piece of energy infrastructure was on fire. Saudi Arabia was forced to cut its oil production by 5.7 million barrels per day, roughly half of its total national output, in what became the single largest sudden disruption to global oil supply in all of recorded history. The price of oil spiked overnight by the largest single-day percentage in decades. Markets across the world shuttered and recalculated. Governments from Washington to Beijing to Tokyo to Berlin scrambled to assess what had happened, what it meant, and what they would do if it happened again. And the question that hung in the air with the smoke from those burning separation towers was this: who did this? And what happens next? The Houthis claimed responsibility immediately. But the attack profile, the precision, the coordination, the use of both cruise missiles and drones in a complex, multi-directional assault that came from angles Saudi air defenses had not been oriented to defend, pointed to a capability far beyond what most analysts believed the Houthis possessed on their own. American intelligence assessed that the attacks had been launched with direct Iranian operational support, possibly from Iranian territory. Iran denied everything, as it always does, as it has practiced doing for 40 years. With such consistency that the denial itself has become almost ceremonial, a ritual acknowledgement that the rules of this game require denial even when the evidence is overwhelming. Saudi Arabia was left in the position it has occupied for years, knowing with high confidence who is truly responsible, but lacking the clean, legal, internationally recognized evidence that would be required to justify a direct military response against a country that possesses nuclear ambitions, ballistic missiles capable of reaching every capital in the Gulf, and the ability to close the Strait of Hormuz. That is the trap Saudi Arabia is caught in, and it is a trap built with extraordinary strategic intelligence by the Iranians. Every time Iran strikes through its proxies, Saudi Arabia faces a terrible and inescapable choice: strike back directly against Iran and risk a full-scale regional war that could pull in the United States, Israel, and every Gulf state, destroying economies and ending thousands of lives. Or absorb the attack, respond against the Houthis in Yemen, as Saudi Arabia has done, over and over with airstrikes that kill fighters and civilians alike, and watch as Iran quietly nods with satisfaction and continues the strategy, knowing its opponent is constrained by the same fears that have kept the Middle East from erupting into total regional war for decades. It is a choice between bad and catastrophic, and Iran has engineered it with cold precision. Iran knows this trap exists. Iran has known it for years. It is the foundation of their entire regional strategy. Apply pressure through proxies, deny involvement, force the enemy to choose between escalation they cannot afford and restraint that makes them look weak. It is a strategy that requires patience, resources, and a willingness to sacrifice the populations of proxy territories as pawns in a game too large for them to understand or escape. And Iran has demonstrated all three of these qualities in full measure and without apparent remorse. But what has changed, what is driving the current escalation beyond anything that came before, is that Iran's proxy network has evolved from a tool of political pressure into a genuine military force capable of things that were unimaginable even 5 years ago. The Houthis are no longer the ragged mountain fighters of 2014 who swept down from their strongholds on sheer momentum, desperation, and the charismatic power of religious conviction. They are now a sophisticated professional military organization with Iranian-supplied ballistic missiles that can travel over 2,000 kilometers with meaningful accuracy, attack drones that carry precision warheads, and can be launched in coordinated swarms designed to overwhelm air defenses by sheer numbers, anti-ship missiles that have struck commercial vessels in the Red Sea, and an intelligence and targeting capability that speaks to deep, ongoing operational Iranian integration in their military planning and execution. The Red Sea has become the new front line, and its transformation has been sudden and devastating. Since late 2023, the Houthis launched a campaign of attacks against commercial shipping in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden that was unprecedented in its scale, its duration, and its immediate real-world economic consequences. They targeted vessels they claimed had connections to Israel, framing the attacks as solidarity with Palestinians in Gaza, a framing that won them genuine sympathy in parts of the Arab world, while simultaneously disrupting global trade in ways that hurt the very people whose sympathy they were seeking to win. The attacks caused an immediate and dramatic rerouting of global shipping. Dozens of the world's largest shipping companies diverted their vessels away from the Suez Canal route, the fastest, cheapest path connecting Asian manufacturing to European and American markets, and forced them around the southern tip of Africa, adding weeks and millions of dollars in cost to every single voyage. Insurance rates exploded, port schedules collapsed. Supply chains that had been built on the assumption of Red Sea passage found themselves suddenly expensively broken. Lloyd's of London, one of the world's most authoritative insurance markets, the institution that has priced maritime risk for centuries, designated the Red Sea a high-risk zone. Container shipping rates exploded to levels not seen since the disruptions of the pandemic. And the disruption rippled through global supply chains in ways that ordinary people felt not in the news, but in the prices they paid for goods in shops, in the delays they experienced waiting for products they had ordered, in the inflation numbers that governments scrambled to explain to bewildered citizens, wondering why everything suddenly cost more. The United States and the United Kingdom launched military strikes against Houthi targets in Yemen, calling the operations by names designed to signal resolve and capability. But the strikes did not stop the attacks. The Houthis absorbed them, repaired what they could, replaced what they could not, declared they would continue indefinitely, and kept firing. This was a statement, not just to the US and UK, but to Saudi Arabia, to every government watching from the region, that this movement that Iran had patiently built over decades in Yemen's mountains had become something that the most powerful military alliance in history could not simply switch off with airstrikes and press releases. Something had changed in the fundamental nature of this proxy force, and everyone could see it. And every missile that flies toward a ship in the Red Sea is a missile that could just as easily be pointed north and slightly east into Saudi territory. Every demonstration of Houthi resilience against American and British air power is a demonstration of what Saudi Arabia is facing permanently on its southern border, an adversary that is effectively immune to the kind of decisive military pressure that would normally end a conflict, backed by a patron that has no intention of ending it. Now comes the critical question, the question that everyone in the region is wrestling with, that analysts in Washington and London and Beijing are debating with growing urgency. Has Saudi Arabia reached a point where it has no choice but to change its entire approach? Or it must go beyond managing this conflict and actually try to end it, even at the cost of direct confrontation with Iran? The fresh attacks that have shaken Saudi Arabia are not coming only from Yemen anymore. That would be manageable in a terrible way. The geography would be contained, the threat axis would be predictable. But Iranian-backed militia groups in Iraq, the so-called Islamic resistance in Iraq, an umbrella of Shia-armed factions deeply tied to Iran's IRGC, have escalated their operations in ways that open new attack vectors. Drones and missiles have been launched from Iraqi territory in operations that probed Saudi and allied defenses from a different direction entirely. Rocket attacks on U.S. military bases in Iraq and Syria have killed American soldiers, an act that forced Washington into direct military confrontation with the Iran-backed groups and has further narrowed the narrow space for quiet diplomacy. Hezbollah in Lebanon, Iran's most powerful, most capable, most deeply integrated proxy force, has continued firing across the Israeli border with a rhythm and a persistence that keeps the entire northern front of the region locked in a constant state of armed tension, threatening to collapse into full war with each new escalation. The entire Iran-constructed network of proxies, from Hezbollah in Lebanon to Hamas in Gaza to the Houthis in Yemen to the militias in Iraq and Syria, has been activated simultaneously, pressed into service, and pointed in coordinated directions that stretch the defensive capacity of every country in their path, and force Saudi Arabia to watch all of these fires burn while managing its own front. Saudi Arabia sits at the center of this web. Not the only target, not the most immediately threatened, but the one whose stability or destabilization would shake the entire global order in ways that no other country's collapse could match or replicate. Because the world cannot afford to forget what Saudi Arabia actually is in the global economic architecture. It is not just a country. It is the world's most critical oil supplier, the anchor of OPEC, the holder of the world's largest proven oil reserves at over 250 billion barrels, and the country whose output decisions can move global oil prices by 10% with a single press conference. When Abqaiq burned in 2019, global markets felt it within hours, and governments across the world convened emergency meetings before the fires were even out. If a broader conflict drags Saudi oil infrastructure into sustained damage or forces the country into a full wartime posture that disrupts production for weeks rather than days, the economic consequences will be felt in every city, every home, every economy on the planet. No country escapes this, not the United States, not China, not Europe, not India, not the billions of people in developing economies who have no political voice in the Middle East, but who will bear the heaviest burden if Saudi oil stops flowing at the volumes the world depends on. Iran understands this with perfect clarity. This is not coincidence or opportunism in the targeting of Saudi infrastructure. The deliberate, persistent focus on Saudi oil facilities and energy infrastructure has never been random. It is a message encoded in fire and smoke. A message that says Iran holds something like a global hostage. That the world's dependence on Saudi oil is a vulnerability that Iran can exploit whenever the price is right. That the cost of opposing Iran's regional ambitions, the cost of standing in the way of a Shia revolutionary project that has been building for 40 years, is not just a military cost paid in soldiers and equipment, but an economic one that cascades far beyond any battlefield and reaches into the lives of people who have never heard of Abqaiq or the Strait of Hormuz or the IRGC. Saudi Arabia's Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman has been navigating this impossible position with a combination of sustained military pressure in Yemen, extensive diplomatic maneuvering with regional and global powers, and the deliberate cultivation of new alliances designed to reduce Saudi Arabia's strategic dependence on any single protector. He is not an easy man. He is not universally admired. His decisions have drawn sharp international criticism, particularly the killing of journalist Jamal Khashoggi in 2018 and the civilian casualties resulting from Saudi airstrikes in Yemen. But he is a strategist, and he has understood clearly for years that the kingdom he inherited faces threats that require transformation, not just defense. That building walls is not enough when the enemy can fly over them. The normalization agreement that China brokered between Saudi Arabia and Iran in 2023 was one of the most significant diplomatic events in the region in decades. After years of severed ties, after Saudi Arabia cut diplomatic relations with Iran in 2016 following the Iranian government's failure to protect Saudi diplomatic missions during protests over the execution of Shia cleric Sheikh Nimr al-Nimr, the two countries agreed to restore relations, exchange ambassadors, and explore economic cooperation. China's role as the broker was itself a statement, a signal that the United States was no longer the only power capable of shaping Middle Eastern diplomacy, and that Saudi Arabia was actively managing its relationships to give itself options beyond the American alliance. That agreement brought cautious hope to the region. Ambassadors returned to their posts. Trade discussions began in halting, careful steps. There was measured language from both sides about new chapters and new opportunities, and for a brief moment, a window that felt almost miraculous given the depth of the rivalry, the temperature seemed to drop just slightly, just enough for people who work in diplomacy and who have seen these cycles before to let themselves believe, just for a moment, that something might be different this time. It was not different. The underlying causes of the conflict were never resolved in those diplomatic meetings. They could not be resolved in those meetings because they are not primarily about the specific disputes that can be negotiated away at a table. They are about fundamentally incompatible visions of how the Middle East should be organized, who should lead it, whose interpretation of Islam should guide it, and whose influence should shape the governments that rule over hundreds of millions of people. These are not the kinds of disagreements that ambassadors dissolve over tea. The Houthis did not put down their weapons because Iran and Saudi Arabia exchanged ambassadors. The Iraqi militias did not disband. The IRGC did not shut down its overseas operations, and the attacks kept coming. sometimes larger, sometimes more targeted, always persistent, always carrying the clear message that Iran's fundamental strategy had not changed. Only the diplomatic language around it had been briefly softened. The 2023 normalization deal was not an end to the conflict. It was a pause, a diplomatic breath between rounds, a chance for both sides to take stock and prepare their next moves. And now that breath has expired, and what has followed is a fresh wave of attacks that has pulled Saudi Arabia not shallower, but deeper into the architecture of this war, deeper into the calculations of escalation, deeper into the uncomfortable space where restraint begins to look indistinguishable from weakness. The specific geometry of the new attacks matters. What makes the current moment different from previous escalations is not just the frequency or the scale of the strikes, but the targeting logic and the operational sophistication that lies behind them. Earlier attacks focused heavily on oil infrastructure and military installations, targets that carried enormous value, but that could be framed, however implausibly, as strictly military. The new wave has expanded the targeting logic in ways that military analysts read as deliberate and calculated escalation. Strikes that test Saudi air defense systems in multiple directions simultaneously. Coordinated multi-vector assault patterns that look less like harassment designed to annoy and more like rehearsal designed to map, like preparation for something larger. Saudi Arabia's Patriot missile defense batteries have performed with genuine capability, intercepting many of the incoming threats. But no air defense system in history has a perfect record. The math of attrition, when you apply it to ballistic missiles and drone swarms, is brutal in a way that no amount of technological sophistication fully escapes. When an adversary launches enough projectiles, enough times, from enough different directions, with enough variation in speed and altitude and approach angle, eventually something gets through. Not because the defenders failed, but because the mathematics of probability eventually produces its terrible result. And the Houthis and their Iranian controllers are learning from every engagement. They are studying the intercepts, analyzing the patterns, identifying the gaps in coverage and the weaknesses in response timing. Every failed attack is an intelligence collection opportunity. Every successful intercept reveals where protection is strongest, which means it also reveals by subtraction where protection is not. This is what makes the relentless, grinding pace of attacks so strategically valuable to Iran beyond their immediate damage. It is not just harassment designed to drain Saudi resources and test Saudi morale, though it does both of those things effectively. It is intelligence gathering at industrial scale, a continuous, real-time probe of Saudi defensive architecture that Iran is filing, analyzing, and incorporating into planning for operations that go beyond anything they have launched so far. Saudi Arabia has been forced to spend staggering resources defending against this financial, military, and political capital that compounds in its costs over years. The price of maintaining constant air defense readiness, of replacing Patriot interceptor missiles that cost millions of dollars each time one fires, of keeping Air Force pilots at sustained high alert, of manning radar stations around the clock across a country with one of the longest land borders in the world. These costs accumulate. They crowd out spending on other priorities. They keep the kingdom in a defensive crouch when it would prefer to be moving forward. The United States has repeatedly worked to replenish Saudi defense capabilities and has maintained military assets in the region, specifically to reinforce Gulf security. But this support comes with conditions, political conditions, congressional debates, the complications of an American domestic politics that has grown increasingly uncertain about long-term Middle Eastern military commitments after Afghanistan, after years of Iraq, after the accumulated exhaustion of a public that is tired of reading about conflicts in places their children cannot find on a map. There is a growing reluctance in Washington to write blank checks for Gulf security without demanding something in return. And that reluctance, even when it does not change the ultimate American commitment, creates uncertainty, and uncertainty is something Iran knows how to exploit. Saudi Arabia is, for perhaps the first time in its modern history, genuinely navigating a strategic landscape that feels fundamentally less safe than anything it has experienced before. Not completely without support. The American alliance remains, the weapons continue to flow, the security partnership continues in its various forms. But the certainty, the deep and comfortable confidence that American power would ultimately protect the kingdom from existential challenges, that confidence has developed cracks that no amount of diplomatic reassurance fully repairs. The American withdrawal from Afghanistan in 2021 carried out in a manner that left allies questioning American strategic resolve. The limits of American power demonstrated in the ongoing Ukrainian conflict, where American support has been real but insufficient to produce a decisive outcome. The domestic debate in Washington about strategic priorities and the limits of American capacity. All of these have sent signals to Riyadh that the shield of American protection, while still very real, is no longer absolute. That Saudi Arabia cannot assume a savior will always arrive in time. This is driving Saudi Arabia towards something that MBS has been quietly building for years. Genuine strategic self-reliance. And the kingdom has been dramatically increasing its own military production capability, investing in domestic defense industries designed to reduce dependence on suppliers who attach conditions to their sales. It has diversified its diplomatic relationships with a boldness that would have been politically unthinkable a decade ago, deepening economic and strategic ties with China, managing a complex relationship with Russia, building partnerships with India and Southeast Asian powers that give Saudi Arabia options and leverage it did not previously possess. It has pursued its own nuclear development conversations, letting it be known in quiet but unmistakable terms that if Iran acquires nuclear weapons capability, Saudi Arabia will not remain a non-nuclear state indefinitely. A statement that carries profound implications for the global non-proliferation architecture and for every country that has staked its security calculations on the assumption that the Gulf will remain nuclear-free. Mohammed bin Salman is playing an extraordinarily long game. He is a leader who has understood and stated publicly that the kingdom he inherited faces existential threats that require fundamental transformation. Not merely military transformation, but the complete economic and social reinvention that he calls Vision 2030. The goal is a Saudi Arabia that can survive and thrive in a world where oil wealth may not be permanent, where the global energy transition could eventually diminish the strategic importance of Saudi reserves, where the kingdom needs industries beyond petroleum, tourism beyond religious pilgrimage, and a population of young Saudis with skills and opportunities that do not depend entirely on the price of crude oil. He is building a Saudi Arabia that can exist and compete in a post-oil world. And Iran is watching this transformation with something beyond military concern. A prosperous, diversified, confident Saudi Arabia that has built robust alliances across Asia, Africa, Europe, and the Americas. A Saudi Arabia that has reduced its dependence on oil, modernized its economy, and developed the domestic capacity to sustain its own security is a dramatically more dangerous adversary for Iran than a kingdom made, fearful, isolated, dependent, and constantly distracted by attacks on its borders. Iran's attacks on Saudi Arabia are military operations, yes, but they are also economic warfare. They are an attempt to make Vision 2030 fail. Every international investor who hesitates to commit capital to Saudi Arabia because of security concerns is a victory for Iran. Every resource that must be diverted from development projects to defense spending is a victory for Iran. Every moment of domestic uncertainty, every Saudi citizen who wonders whether their country can actually be safe, is a victory for Iran. The fresh Iranian attacks, whether executed directly or through the Houthi network or the Iraqi militias, are not purely military provocations. They are attempts to derail a transformation that, if successful, would cement Saudi Arabia as a power that Iran cannot easily contain or pressure. They are a bet that the accumulated cost of constant attacks, the financial cost, the human cost, the psychological cost, the political cost, will either force Saudi Arabia into a reckless military escalation that Iran can frame as aggression or break Saudi Arabia's confidence and ambition from the inside. Now the wider regional context swirls into this picture and makes everything more volatile. The conflict in Gaza that erupted in October 2023 shattered the delicate diplomatic architecture that had been carefully, painstakingly constructed across the region over years of quiet negotiation. The Abraham Accords, the normalization agreements between Israel and the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Morocco, and Sudan, Fatih had represented something that many people in the region and beyond had dared to call a new dawn. Arab states and Israel finding common ground against the Iranian threat, building economic partnerships and security cooperation that transcended the old conflicts and the old narratives. Saudi Arabia had been moving toward its own potential normalization with Israel, cautiously, carefully, with conditions attached, in a diplomatic process that the American administration had invested enormous political capital in facilitating, and that would have represented perhaps the most seismic realignment in Middle Eastern geopolitics since the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty of 1979. Gaza stopped that process in its tracks. The images from the conflict, the scale of civilian suffering, the footage that circulated on every phone screen in the Arab world, these made it politically impossible for any Arab government to sign a normalization deal with Israel while the fighting continued. And Iran watched this happen and understood immediately, clearly, that the Gaza conflict had served its strategic interests in a profound way. It had fractured the emerging coalition of Arab states and Israel that had been forming against Iran's regional ambitions. It had returned the Palestinian cause to the center of Arab political consciousness in a way that constrained every Arab leader as room for maneuver. It had given Iran's proxy forces a narrative, resistance, solidarity, the defense of the oppressed, that resonated powerfully across the Arab and Muslim world. Saudi Arabia now finds itself in a position of compounding strategic difficulty. Its potential new partner, Israel, is locked in its own existential conflict with no clear end. Its traditional protector, America, is consumed by domestic political divisions and strategic debates about overextension. Its own territory is under persistent attack from a proxy network that has been fighting for years and has demonstrated it cannot be defeated by air power alone. Its regional diplomacy has been complicated by Gaza in ways that limit its options. And the global powers whose support it seeks are each pursuing their own interests in ways that do not always align with Saudi Arabia's needs. China wants Saudi oil, but also wants its Iranian trade relationships. Russia wants regional influence, but has its own calculations that do not map onto Saudi security requirements. Even the closest Gulf allies, the UAE, Bahrain, Kuwait, are each managing their own relationships with Iran and their own calculations about the costs of standing fully with Saudi Arabia, against a power that can reach them too. Saudi Arabia is not isolated, but it is more alone than it has been since the kingdom was founded. And the awareness of that condition, the awareness that help may not arrive in the time and form that is needed, is reshaping how Riyadh thinks about the Iran threat and what it is willing to risk to address it. There are voices inside Saudi Arabia and inside the global security establishment who argue that the only way to change the trajectory of this conflict is to strike at its source, to attack the IRGC infrastructure inside Iran that designs, produces, and delivers the weapons being used against Saudi Arabia and its neighbors, to make Iran pay a direct, undeniable price for what its proxies do, not a price extracted from the Yemeni civilian population that bears the cost of Saudi airstrikes, but a direct price paid in Iranian capability and Iranian blood. The argument is that Iran's proxy strategy functions precisely because Iran itself remains insulated from the consequences of what its proxies do. The moment that Iran's own territory, Iran's own military installations, Iran's own civilian infrastructure becomes vulnerable to the same kind of attacks that Iran has been directing at others, the calculation changes. The strategy stops being cost-free. This argument is powerful in logic. Iran has its own deterrent capabilities that are not theoretical. It has hundreds of ballistic missiles capable of reaching every capital in the Gulf region. It has demonstrated the ability and willingness to use them. It has the capacity to close the Strait of Hormuz, through which roughly 20% of all the world's traded oil flows every day. Chase, an act that would trigger an immediate global energy crisis of consequences that would dwarf anything yet seen. It has Hezbollah in Lebanon with over 100,000 rockets and missiles pointed at Israel, ready to ignite a northern front that would draw Israel, and very likely the United States, into open warfare simultaneously. It has the capability to activate all of its proxy networks at once, in Yemen, in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon, and Gaza, creating a multi-front conflagration that would overwhelm the response capacity of every country in the region. A direct Saudi attack on Iran would not be a contained surgical operation that resolves the conflict cleanly and quickly. It would be the opening act of a regional war that would make everything that has come before look, in retrospect, like the quiet months before the real storm. This is why Saudi Arabia has not done it. This is why, despite 40 years of Iranian aggression by proxy, despite the burning oil fields and the airport sirens and the dead soldiers, Saudi Arabia has held back from the direct strike that its military capability would allow, not from weakness, not from indifference to its own suffering, from a cold, clear-eyed calculation that the war it could start might be incomparably worse than the war it is already fighting. But calculations can change. Thresholds can be crossed in the night by a single drone carrying a payload that finds the gap in the radar coverage and the gap in the response time, and lands somewhere that cannot be forgiven, cannot be absorbed, cannot be explained away as acceptable cost. History is full of wars that none of their architects wanted, wars that started with exactly this kind of crossing. This single incident, where the accumulated pressure of years found the one moment where restraint finally catastrophically failed. The July crisis of 1914, the Gulf of Tonkin, the assassination on the street in Sarajevo. History does not warn us about these moments. It only records them afterward, in the silence that follows the explosion. The missiles are still flying over Saudi Arabia tonight. The drones are still launching from Yemeni hillsides. The fires that burned at Abqaiq have been repaired but not forgotten. They live in the calculations of every Saudi general, every oil market analyst, every government that depends on the stability of the world's energy supply. Saudi Arabia has been pulled deeper into this war with each fresh attack, each new front, each new weapon system that Iran delivers to forces that Saudi Arabia cannot reach without crossing lines that the whole world is watching. What happens next will not stay contained in the Middle East. It never has. It will come to you, in the price at the fuel pump, in the cost of goods that travel Red Sea shipping lanes, in the energy bills that families across the world pay without ever knowing, that a drone over a desert thousands of miles away helped set the number, in the security decisions that governments make when the most strategically critical region on Earth is destabilizing in real time, in the choices that nuclear powers make when smaller conflicts threaten to draw in larger ones. Saudi Arabia is caught between the war it is fighting and the war it is trying to avoid. Between the attacks it is absorbing and the response that its pride and its security demand. Between the transformation it needs to achieve and the crisis that keeps pulling it backward. Between the alliance it has with America and the doubts it is developing about whether that alliance will hold in the moment that matters most. Iran has been patient for 40 years. It has built its network slowly, funded its proxies carefully, and struck at Saudi Arabia repeatedly. Never enough to trigger the total war that would end the strategy, always enough to keep the pressure constant and the cost mounting. It is the most effective long-term geopolitical strategy of pressure in the modern era, and it is working. The question is not whether Saudi Arabia has been pulled deeper into this war. It has been pulled in further with every rocket, every drone, every fire, every year that this conflict continues without resolution. The question now is whether the rope has a length, whether there is a point, a specific attack, a specific moment of crossed threshold, beyond which Saudi Arabia's strategic patience runs out and a different, more direct, more dangerous response becomes inevitable. Whether Iran, confident in its strategy and emboldened by decades of apparent impunity, will push too far and find out that the trap it has spent 40 years setting has two jaws, and that the second jaw can close on Iran just as surely as the first one has been closing on Saudi Arabia. The smoke over Riyadh is still rising. The sirens are still real. The math of escalation is getting harder to argue against. And somewhere in Tehran, someone who has been playing this game for a very long time is watching, waiting, and wondering, just as the Saudis are, whether this time the match they are playing with will finally light something they cannot put out. The Middle East has been here before, right on the edge, right where the wrong move ends everything. It has never fallen off, not yet, but the edge is getting closer, and the footing is getting worse. And nobody, not in Riyadh, not in Tehran, not in Washington, not in Beijing, not in any capital where serious people are sitting with serious faces, reading serious intelligence reports, nobody is certain anymore that the fall will not come. That is what makes right now so different. That is what makes right now something the whole world needs to understand before it becomes too late to understand anything at all. There is one more dimension to this story, one that most coverage overlooks because it lives in the long, slow movement of economics rather than in the sudden drama of missiles and fire. But that may ultimately matter more than any single military engagement or diplomatic summit. It is the dimension of time, of how long this can continue before something breaks that cannot be repaired. Saudi Arabia's budget depends on oil revenues the way a body depends on blood. The Saudi government's fiscal break-even price, the price at which oil needs to sell for the Saudi budget to balance without deficit spending, has risen over years as the kingdom invests in Vision 2030, in military modernization, in social spending programs, designed to give young Saudis the opportunities and quality of life that prevent the kind of discontent that has toppled other Arab governments. Every military operation in Yemen costs money. Every Patriot interceptor fired costs money. Every new weapons purchase, every new air defense upgrade, every new intelligence system required by the escalating threat, all of it costs money that must come from somewhere, and for Saudi Arabia, that somewhere is ultimately oil. This is the economic pressure point that Iran is applying with every attack. Not the direct damage, which Saudi Arabia has proven it can repair with remarkable speed, but the cumulative budget pressure, the investment uncertainty, the opportunity cost of military spending that crowds out the diversification investment that Vision 2030 requires. Iran does not need to destroy Saudi Arabia's economy to win this dimension of the conflict. It only needs to slow Saudi Arabia's transformation, to keep the kingdom spending on defense when it needs to be investing in the future, to keep international capital hesitating when Saudi Arabia needs it to flow confidently. The young Saudis who have grown up under Vision 2030 are watching this with their own calculations. An entire generation has been told that their country is transforming, that they will have jobs outside the oil sector, opportunities in technology and tourism and finance, a future that is modern and confident and not defined by the ancient rivalries their grandparents lived through. This generation is now old enough to understand what the sirens mean, old enough to ask whether the promise of transformation can survive a war, old enough to feel the gap between the Saudi Arabia of NEOM and the Red Sea project and the Saudi Arabia of bunkers and air defense alerts. MBS understands this. He understands that losing the confidence of this generation, the generation his whole vision is built for and depends on, would be a strategic defeat more serious than any military setback. And so the pressure he faces is not only external, from Iranian missiles and Houthi drones, it is internal, from a generation of young Saudis who need to believe that their country's future is more powerful than its past conflicts. Iran knows about this internal pressure too. Iran's intelligence services are sophisticated, well-resourced, and deeply experienced in reading the internal dynamics of Gulf societies. They understand that the most powerful weapon against Vision 2030 is not a missile, but doubt. Not destruction, but delay. Not the burning of a refinery, but the erosion of confidence that rebuilding is worth the cost. Every attack that makes a foreign investor reconsider. Every attack that makes a young Saudi engineer question whether the new Saudi Arabia is real or just a campaign. Every attack that reminds the world that, for all its ambition, this kingdom is still a country under fire. These are Iran's most effective weapons, and they cost far less than ballistic missiles. The global energy markets are the final audience for all of this, the ultimate arbiter of whether Saudi Arabia's position is strengthening or weakening under this sustained pressure. When traders in London and New York and Singapore price Saudi Arabian oil risk, when they factor in the probability of infrastructure disruption, when they calculate the insurance premium on Saudi supply, they are making a collective judgment about whether the Saudi state can defend what it has. Right now, that judgment is still relatively stable. The markets have not panicked in the way they did briefly after Abqaiq. The reason is partly that Saudi Arabia has demonstrated genuine defensive capability and genuine repair capacity, but it is also partly that the markets have not fully priced in what a significant escalation would mean, because the full scenario, the one where Iran's network activates fully and attacks come from multiple directions simultaneously, is something that the models struggle to value because it has not happened before. When it does, if it does, the governments that have been watching this unfold with cautious detachment will discover what it means to have no contingency plan for a world where Saudi oil is suddenly, genuinely at risk. This is the final truth of what Saudi Arabia's deepening entrapment means for the rest of us. We are all downstream of this conflict, every economy that depends on stable energy prices, every government that assumes the Suez Canal route will function, every supply chain built on the assumption that the Persian Gulf will remain open. The war being fought in the deserts and sea lanes of the Middle East is not someone else, it is war. It has never been someone else's war. It is a war the world pays for every day, in prices and disruptions in the quiet, invisible tax of instability in the most critical energy corridor on Earth. And as Saudi Arabia gets pulled deeper, as the attacks grow fresher, the threshold gets closer, and the patience wears thinner, the world gets pulled a little deeper too, whether it realizes it or not. The fire in the Middle East does not ask permission before it spreads.